Wir werden jetzt ein Interview machen, oder ich werde jetzt ein Interview machen mit Ren Ferguson. Ich werde das in Englisch führen. Wenn einer was nicht versteht, sofort brüllen und fragen, ich übersetze dann zurück. Einverstanden? Also das ist Ren Ferguson, ich kenne ihn schon viele Jahre. Er hatte früher einen eigenen Shop, er hat lange Jahre bei Gibson gearbeitet, in Montana, in Nashville, in Montana. Dann ist er vor nicht allzu langer Zeit zu Fender gewechselt, hat dann die Guild-Fabrik betreut und seit 2 Jahren, aber das kann man ihn gleich selber fragen, arbeitet er für Shadow, für eine Fabrik in China, ist Partner da und berät und hilft. Der Besitzer sitzt übrigens hier vorne in der ersten Reihe, das ist Joe Marinic, der Inhaber von Shadow und Shadow Gitarren, hier vorne, der mit den blauen Handschuhen. Schön, dass du hier bist. Und unser Thema habt ihr gelesen, eine Gitarrenlegende, der alles über die alten Gitarren gelernt hat, der sein Wissen jetzt in die neue Welt transportiert und im Prinzip Building the Future hört sich auf Englisch viel besser an als auf Deutsch, aber das ist genau das, was er macht. So, du hast bestimmt nichts verstanden? Okay, he doesn't get German, that's good.
Thank you.
So that's Ren Ferguson. Give a big hand for Ren.
Thank you.
Ren, you're a guitar builder. You started a couple of years ago with an own shop, right? Tell us something
Yes.
about that. What did you do then at that time?
The first time that I attempted to build an instrument was a banjo neck for my brother in 1962.
Oh my God.
And it was it was absolutely a beautiful failure. I didn't play an instrument at that point other than the tuba. And maybe I should have thought there was something to the placement of the frets in relation to one another, or that they might need to be parallel, but I avoided both of those, and so it didn't work.
But it sounded like a banjo, right?
It still was a heck of a weapon, you know. So I got a job at a music store. I was in high school and I was trying to play American football, and I went to a school that had hundreds and hundreds of kids, literally thousands. And to make the grade for the football team, you had to weigh about 300 pounds and eat raw meat 4 or 5 times a day. So my position on the team was either I was left out or I was a tackling dummy. And I didn't really enjoy that part of the sport. And the only reason I did it is because I thought girls were interested in football players or sports people, and I wasn't going to make the grade. So I also noticed that at that time the folk boom had just really started. It was in 1960, 61, 62, in that period. And I thought, well, why not play a guitar? It shouldn't hurt too much. However, it was a harmony, and it was much like playing a barbed wire fence. The action wasn't even possible to fret it above the 5th fret at all. So I fixed it, and I worked on it, and then I thought maybe I needed a better guitar, and I went to the music store, and I just fell in love with all the instruments that were on the wall.
And you found that the girls are attracting guitar players too.
I'm still looking. So, in the meantime, I have a wonderful wife and a flock of children and grandchildren and all. But I thought the instruments were just incredible, and I was hooked to the music. And I asked the guy for a job, and he said, well, you know, what can you do? And I said, I'm a woodworker, I'm in a wood shop at school, and I can, you know, fix stuff. So he allowed me to work for a couple hours a day after school, and I began to learn from him how to rehair bows and replace pads and springs, and I worked on wind instruments and all of the wood working that was required. And I started doing repair work privately for either individuals or other music stores at home. My father had a furniture sales room, and he had a big spray booth, so I was buying up old Fender guitars and stripping the finish and repainting them. And those are all the vintage guitars that have been ruined, by the way. I'm personally responsible for most of them, I think.
Yeah, but at that time nobody cared about it.
They didn't.
I know. It happened to me too.
I went on a train to Chicago, well, to Michigan to visit grandparents, and on the way back I stopped in Chicago and I bought a whole bunch of Strats and broadcasters and Telecasters and threw the cases in the alley and tied them all together on my back and carried them home. And they were cheap. You could get anything at that time. Anyhow, I kept or continued to repair instruments, and one night after a date, a frustrating date, I laid in bed thinking about what work I had to do on Saturday the following day, and I was going to glue a bridge on a guitar, replace a side on a Martin double O. I had a top to replace on a Gibson and a neck to refret, and I was laying there, and I had been doing this now for a few years, and it came to me like someone turning the light on. If you want, you could take all new parts and make a guitar. I didn't do it right away because I thought I needed permission. And so I sought out a luthier in our area and was being given good information from him. And after a little while, he found out I was interested in steel strings, and he threw me out of his shop because all he built were classical guitars, and he didn't think that steel strings belonged on an instrument. So but I taught myself.
But it's really this thing which is common. You learn by doing.
Yeah.
You learn by doing, and you learn from mistakes, and you learn from the past, which is our theme today. You learn from the past how guitars are made, or are made better, right?
There wasn't anybody to really ask at that time. It was, I don't know, the airport where I lived right at Los Angeles Airport, and they hired people there to break every guitar that someone took on the plane. And when it came in the baggage, it was broken, they would say, well, go to this music store, and they would go, and so they brought the broken instruments to me. Instruments were cheap. I offered to buy the broken instrument from the individual, and they then used the money plus what they got from the airport for the damage, and they bought a new guitar. So my boss was really happy. I was really happy because many of the instruments were really vintage at that point, and I'm talking from the 1900 to 1940. And anything from an O-style Gibson to a D28, they were all there at one time. And I needed to fix them, so I was taking them apart and trying to pay attention to learn why did this one sound different than that one, and why did this one stay together better than that one with the same abuse.
So this was a thing which was very helpful a couple of years later, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
We're going to skip to these very soon. So you started building guitars in your shop?
I did.
How long did you do that?
I started building guitars in '71 and stayed at that. Started a luthier school and stayed at that till '75, and then left Southern California and moved to first to Colorado for a couple of years and worked with my brother on some really beautiful homes, and then relocated to Montana.
Okay. And that's how you came up with Gibson? Or was it just
not exactly.
Not then at that time.
I went to Montana to be a trapper, and I was also building guns. I mean, I wasn't any good at trapping girls, so I figured I'd make my living with small defenseless animals, So I was doing that, and I had to work part of the year, and so I was making replica firearms and doing gun work for people. And a fella, Steve Carlson, who had begun flat iron mandolin, he heard about this guy who had been a guitar maker, and he called and offered me a job over the phone one night, and I was very flattered. I said, well, thank you. Yes, I made mandolins, and yes, I made guitars, and yes, I made banjos, but I'm working 40 hours a week for Shiloh Sharps, building guns for them. I have my own gun store for repair, and I'm traveling with my church band. I just can't see how I could possibly do any more work than I'm doing, because I have a family by now. And he said, well, I understand. I was going to pay you $1,800 a month. And I said, I'll see you in the morning. And so I went to visit with Steve, and he was just in the part of his career where he was developing a carved top mandolin. And if you haven't ever held an F-style mandolin of anybody's manufacturer, you should hold it. It's much like holding a baby. Every part of it is sensual and warm and just delightful to look at. There's so much going on.
It's a piece of art, right?
Yeah.
It's a piece of art.
So I accepted the position with him, and that was in June. About a year and a half later, we had increased our production so dramatically that we were building almost 3 to 1 of our sales. And it was at that time that we went to the NAMM show. Steve took a mandolin and he went to the owner, or to the person that he thought would be the owner at Gibson. That person wasn't there. There was this new guy, tall blonde man named Henry Juskowitz. And Steve said to Henry, you know, you guys don't make mandolins anymore, and we do, and we could be an OEM for you. And Henry said, well, I don't think so. I think we'll just put you out of business, and then it won't be a problem. Stan Jay from Mandolin Brothers convinced Henry that it would be better for the industry to purchase our little company and allow us to build mandolins for them and banjos. And for a couple of years, that's all we did there. And then we had the opportunity to start a guitar factory with all of the materials and machinery that had been left over from his acquisition of Gibson. And they had taken everything that did not produce a Les Paul and took it off the floor so they could concentrate on getting those guitars right as soon as possible. So in, I think it was the end of '89, we brought the stuff up.
And we acquired Gibson in '84, so 5 years later.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we bought a piece of ground, built a building. Steve did the contracting work, and I started to do the training and design of the tools and fixtures that would begin Gibson, Montana.
That's where I met him first. I was invited to see the Gibson factories in Nashville, where the electric guitars were being built, and then we flew over to Montana. First time in my life. You know, Montana is like Germany, the same size, but only 1 million people live in there. So it's in the middle of nowhere and nobody's there. But there you find this little town Bozeman, and there's a guitar factory, which is doing perfect acoustic guitars, mandolins, and all that stuff. And this guy, he used to have Hawaiian shirts at that time, wearing Hawaiian shirts, always looking good, always looking bright. And he was showing me the factory, and I immediately knew this guy knows what he's doing.
Well, I'm not sure that I have learned everything yet, but hanging around with Joe, I'm learning all the time, okay? So the first period, we tried to put together the instruments that were left over from the previous factory in Nashville, and then as we were able to replace them one at a time, we made new tools and fixtures so we could modernize the factory and hopefully standardize production with an eye to replicate the best instruments from Gibson's past, not those that had been made in Nashville in the recent years.
Yeah, that's what I found when I visited you there. The first time I was there, I think 3 times in all, and he was always improving. They started with the old machines, they improved the machines, they improved machinery, and the guitars were getting better every year, for years. Every time I saw them, oh, another step forward, and more like the old ones, not like the one from the 70s, which nobody loved, more like the old ones were. And I think it helped that you had repaired all these old guitars before,
Oh,
right?
sure. You know, the things that work were obvious. I mean, it was maybe more obvious when you had an instrument apart that didn't work. And so you could make a judgment as to which might be the better process to follow. But the evolution of the factory went through a lot of ups and downs, and you know, there were a lot of confusing times with learning to be a big factory and getting people that thought it would be great to hang around with rock and roll stars or folk singers or something to come in and work for you, when in fact it's a factory, and the factory built guitars, and so it was a little bit disillusioning to some of the new employees, and so we had a large turnover for the first few years until we found people that really wanted to participate in the ongoing improvement and were satisfied to not have to come to work thinking that Johnny Cash might walk through the door or something.
But you had a lot of musicians over there, I remember that.
We did, yeah.
And how long did you stay there? How long did you lead the factory?
I was there with Gibson for 27 years.
Wow, that's a long time.
Yeah, I'm a little slow.
Because I don't know so many people who stayed with this Henry guy for such a long time. He was far away.
Henry has been difficult over the years for lots of people. But he gave me the opportunity by trusting me and trusting the workforce to stay in Nashville and not try and fix us. And so when we needed something, he supported us, you know. But he did give me the privilege and the opportunity to stay there and keep doing it.
It's amazing how long he did it and how good the instruments were at that time when he was there. Actually,
Thank you.
I built one from you. I still have it.
Oh, grand.
One he built, and I'm proud of it that I got it. But finally, you left the company, right?
I did. There was a change going on kind of the last 5 years that I was there, and we had a succession of different general managers in the plant, and they had a different requirement or sort of a marching order from other people that Henry had hired at different positions, and they were making demands which eliminated the opportunity for me to continue to improve manufacturing in the manner that I knew it could be done. In the early 90s and up until about 2004, I think, or 5, there was a great cooperation between the people at Martin and Taylor and Gibson, and it wasn't being talked about, it was being lived. And every time Bob Taylor might learn how to get a good piece of masking tape, he would call and tell me, oh, you get it here. And I knew something that was great. I couldn't wait to tell one of the guys at Martin, or here's a good idea, I know you guys can do it, we're not going to be able to do it. And so we traded a lot of technology, we traded a lot of time in swimming pools together, talking about how we could improve and how we could press forward to save the environmental impact on materials by being better stewards of all the wood, and what we could do to first make our employees safe, have an enjoyable place to work, come out with guitars that were consistently improving. All this time in the 90s, I had met Joe Marinek. And although Joe was not building guitars at the time, when I was in Germany or when he was there, all we talked about were the physics of guitar building and the mechanics of what should be done or could be done. And what I didn't have an opportunity to do was to reach into Gibson's pockets and make those kind of decisions and change the technology there after.
So finally you left them from the big G to the big F, from Gibson to Fender?
Well, what actually happened is I had a hunting accident, and it was one of those, you know, there's so much talk about firearms and guns and everything, and of course that end of the gun is quite dangerous, but what happened was I was getting ready to go out the door and in the morning, and I was getting dressed, and I accidentally got my large toe caught in the waistband of my underwear, and I fell, and when I fell, I managed to dislodge and tear off the quad muscle from my leg, my knee. And I tried crazy glue and tape, and it wouldn't work, and I had to have an operation. And my wife said, you're working too hard, you know, and you're going to be off work for probably 90 days. You're going to be 66 years old in February. Why don't you just retire? And I thought maybe that would be a good idea, since for the last few years I really didn't have anything to do except go out and talk to people about guitars, and very, very infrequently I got to build a custom guitar for somebody. But the custom division had really been constrained because they were trying to standardize again everything they did. So I decided to leave, and I gave them some notice, and that was right before our Thanksgiving in the United States. And I then spoke to my son, who had been years before the head of artist relations for Gibson on the West Coast. He had since moved and was now the head of artist relations on the West Coast for Fender. And he was a good friend of Larry Thomas's, and they rode motorcycles together. And he said to Larry, "Oh, my dad's going to retire." And Larry said, "Well, why doesn't he come to work for us? Why don't you call him and see if he'd like to do that?" And my son said, "Why don't you call him?" I don't want to ask him that. So Larry called me and we talked, and we agreed that although I was going to be in a cast for a few months, that I could maybe go to work for Fender. And then when I was healed up enough, I could go to New Hartford and establish a custom shop for the Fender acoustics and help them reestablish the Guild product.
We have to say that New Hartford was the place where the Ovation guitars were being built for 30, 40 years.
Right.
And they had acquired Guild at the time. And Fender had put Guild into that factory. Fender had acquired Ovation, and then they put Guild into that factory. And I think you took over.
It actually went to Southern California first, and then to Tacoma,
right,
Washington, and then back to New Hartford.
And I've been to every Guild factory, from the East Coast to the West Coast to New Hartford. Yeah.
Like a yo-yo.
Yeah,
You know?
exactly. But then you showed up there.
I did, and I found that the building, although it was really charming and a beautiful setting on the Farmington River, and it had a lot of history. It's where Singer sewing machines had been made in the 1840s, and it was this beautiful old block, brick and block building. One of the problems and one of the things that I had learned in my career as working in a gun factory and different guitar factories over the years was that things move linear if they're going to actually stay in cadence. And we looked at that building and we found that there were 5 different floors in 2 buildings, and that the people were hand carrying parts. So I got a team from the university to come in and do some time studies, and we found out that they actually carried parts for 17 miles a day. And there was no way that we could get the efficiency that was required. And on top of that, Connecticut had a lot of really stringent requirements as far as air pollution and the use of lacquer. And so we were actually constrained from making more than so many units a day by just that fact that we couldn't use more lacquer. We couldn't make more instruments.
It was an interesting factory, and a lot of ideas were there, how you do the bracings, how you do the cutaways and all that. And finally, when he quit that factory, and he teamed up with Joe Marage from Shadow, and now we talk about the future.
Okay.
So how could you transport all the technology to this guy, to China, and what's the difference between America and China? Or is there a difference? Is
Food.
Is it important where a guitar is built? So,
yes and no.
okay.
The most important part of how it's built, again, I go back and forth. It's really necessary to protect the employee. It's really, really important to protect the resource. And it's really important to continue with the process of ongoing improvement at every level, every day, but in order. Now, I'm a guitar maker, Joe's an engineer. We have talked about how to do this for, I can't tell you how many years, but I never had the opportunity to work with Joe prior to giving him a call after I left the factory I started for Guild in California. So Joe had already begun the process of offering to build guitars for Epiphone and was well on his way. And I called and I said, "Gee, I'd love to come and see your factory. Is there anything I could do there?" And he said, "Come on over." And so we got together and we started to play. And we chased each other around the shop, and almost daily there was a place that Joe found that we could make an improvement in the process of manufacturing guitars, that we could make better use of the materials, we could make it faster. Now comes in the part of where you make it is the problem. There's a language barrier, and there's a language barrier between Joe and I. Joe speaks 7 languages, okay, fluently. I'm an American, so I speak one poorly. But luckily, he speaks English as well, so we can talk about what makes a guitar work. He knows how to, fashion or fabricate tools and fixtures. More importantly, he had the resources to invest in that technology. It was already well along its way, and I had seen the result of his investments for, I think, 3 years before I joined it here at Mesa. We would get together and he'd show me the videos of the factory, and we always talked into the middle of the night. We had great discussions about what could be and what could make it better. How could we make it more consistent for manufacturers to get the result that didn't vary much? That's never stopped, and hopefully it won't stop for any manufacturer.
It's many people think guitars from China are cheap. Cheap guitars that not made well. I was at that factory. I was at several factories in China, and I can tell that it's not true. But it's nice to hear it from you. Is it really true? Is it important if it's China or United States or whatever?
I think any country could have a guitar factory, or they could have a telephone factory, or they could have a car factory, but they will build for you what you ask for, what you're willing to invest in. So if you give them trash to work with and not good tooling and good advice, and make it clear what the end result needs to be, you're going to get inexpensive, inaccurate, cheap junk. If you give them quality materials, you provide the best tooling, the best training, there's still a language problem. It happens in America with people that only speak English. So if you provide all of that stuff, they can be wonderful craftsmen. They can be I don't know that in Joe's factory he's ever trained anybody that wanted to be a luthier. Okay? These people want to have a job. They want to be secure. There's a problem with an annual turnover after the new year, which is a threat, to everybody in the industry.
Ich sage das mal gerade kurz auf Deutsch. China hat ein sogenanntes Neujahr. Und die Leute kommen aus den Bergen und arbeiten im Süden an der Küste und fahren dann zu diesem Neujahrsfest nach Hause, und viele kommen einfach nicht wieder zurück. Die gehen woanders hin, wo sie mehr Geld kriegen, werden auf der Strecke abgefangen oder was auch immer. Und deswegen hat jede Fabrik in China das Problem, dass sie Teile der Mitarbeiter verlieren zu Neujahren. Das war jetzt gerade erst, ne? Das ist gerade erst gewesen, glaube ich. Nobody knows in Germany what's Chinese New Year.
Oh,
it's different. So, yeah, but it's important to train the people. And I was at the factory. And it's absolutely modern. It's nothing I can
you can't
compare.
believe it.
You can't believe it. It's if there weren't Chinese people, you would think it's in Europe or in the United States or wherever.
It looks like it was here in Germany.
Absolutely, it's high tech. Absolutely high tech, clean.
Yeah.
And the other important thing, I don't know how important it is for you, but I saw great materials. I don't saw cheap wood.
No, it's all solid wood.
So
It's air conditioned, it's humidified, there's wood storage, there's wood drying equipment, there's everything that's required to do the job properly. When we were there for the second trip or something, maybe the third, I said, why is just Epiphone your only customer? You have so much capacity. Why don't we make guitars for other people? Why don't you make guitars that say Shadow? Why don't you have your own product line out there? And so Joe said, why not? Let's try. So we spent another $1 million, made all new molds, all new fixtures, and so we brought out additional models and lines, which were an upgrade, because the guitars that were requested by Epiphone were instruments that were copies of the Japanese instruments that were made back in the 70s by the Koreans now, and then the Koreans made copies, and then they sent those copies to China, and they made copies, and there was always a slight step down every time it changed from one nation to another.
And then we're back to the theme. You and Joe together, you took the best of the old guitars, of the good guitars, and put it into a new one. Not just copying something or make it cheaper or faster, but make it better, right?
Sure.
And I think your experience helped a lot, and Joe's experience as an engineer too. And you came up with great guitars now. But where do you get the wood from in these days? Is it easy?
Well, there's all kinds of issues with lumber around the world. I mean, I used to make a joke and say, well, wood doesn't grow on trees, but in fact it does, or did anyways. And there is so much control hoping to maintain the resource that's available to us that I'm sure all of you have heard of CITES and their I guess their participation in the world trade has led to a lot of compliance requirements that have changed the cost of materials in some cases where it's impossible to do business with a certain type of wood anymore. And so we have looked for a tremendous palette of woods around the world that now are being called tone woods. Before they were lumber. And you know, a lot of guitars can be produced out of wood that you wouldn't recognize as a traditional tone wood, and the difference is in some cases almost negligible. I mean, there are mahoganies that in a blindfold test you can't tell if it's Macrophylla switina, the original genuine mahogany from South America, or whether it's Kaya from Africa or another wood. I mean, there are so many woods available to us that are still in abundance, that are still available, and those are the ones that are being selected now to build the guitars of the future out of.
And I think another point is it's not only the wood, but it's also the way how it's made. Remember your friend Bob Taylor? He did a guitar out of a pallet for a trade show.
Sure.
With nails in it and everything.
Still in it.
And
now
it was sounding good.
Well, it sounded like a Taylor. Don't go too far, okay? And I'm never going to let him live it down. But it was a good guitar, and it played really well. Okay, it was a good instrument. The fact that it had been made out of something that was considered junk, you know, proved the point that wood is just wood. And the reason that Bob did that was he was rebelling against the surge in value that was driving the price of what we considered tone wood up and up and up and up. And just in probably 6 or 8 years, most musical instrument woods had gone through either a triple increase in value or in sometimes 5 to 10 times the value. And he was saying, look, it just doesn't matter. It's only wood until we make this instrument. Until we create this musical instrument, it's just lumber. That's why he made that. He proved the point. About the same time I started traveling around the world and South America looking for additional different types of woods that could be used, and we brought all kinds back and tried them, and they all made good sounding guitars. Some of them were more difficult to work with, some of them were more expensive, some of them were less expensive, some of them didn't look very good. You know, they weren't attractive. And people, unfortunately, and often beginners, make their purchase with their eyes because they're not musicians yet. They just want to learn. They want to get better. So if you consider the instruments that are being built today, and let's take Joe's factory in China, there is nothing that instrument would keep you from becoming a great guitar player on. Nothing. Now you may not like the color, and you may not like the shiny finish or the dull finish, but it will play beautifully. It will handle correctly. I remember that harmony guitar that I bled trying to learn how to play that guitar until I just kind of destroyed it, making it work. But nobody has to do that anymore. For a small amount of money, they can get a guitar that will service them for quite a long time on their learning curve. And in addition to that, there are guitars and some classical guitars and some steel string guitars being made in China now that sell for $1,200, $2,000. They're made by craftsmen with premium materials by hand, not like they're made in Joe's factory. They're made one at a time. It's not efficient, but the quality instruments are exceptional. They just happen to be made in a different address, and some of those instruments aren't made with climate control, and so that being shipped around the world might be a little risky for them. So,
but then your experience helps again. Which,
oh sure.
That's right. And so what are you looking for? If you would buy a guitar, would you buy it if it looks good, if it feels good, or if it sounds good?
I think the feel is, I mean, we used to say that Gibson had a logo and it said tone, feel, and appearance. And what we thought was most important was tone. You know, no one would buy a guitar unless it sounded good. Well, if you can't play it, you'll never know what it sounds like. And if you can't, you won't play it if you don't like the way it looks. You won't even reach for it. Unless you have a friend that said, oh, you have to try this guitar. So appearance is really important, especially for new buyers. It wants to be an attractive instrument, but it has to play well so that they can hear what their potential will be. When I'm asked by any customer which is the guitar I would recommend for them to buy, the only answer that's truthful is the one that will make you want to play instead of going to work, going to bed, going to the dinner table, or anything else. You want to be able to stimulate that drive that we all have to play better, to play more. So the better the instrument, the better the opportunity.
We have a saying, it's a joke. How many guitar players does a guitar player need? The answer, yeah, how many guitars? Just one. More.
Absolutely.
But in these days it's easier to get one more because they're much cheaper than they used to be.
Oh yeah. I mean, now you can afford to have an instrument that you leave in a particular open tuning, or, you know, you can have a whole range of instruments. I mean, everything's changed so much. There's a big variety of steel guitars, national steels and dobros and electric guitars, and I mean, you can have an entire stable of instruments anytime you want now. They're available.
I think one thing has changed when you started working with guitars. When I started playing acoustic guitars, you bought an acoustic guitars. In these days, you can buy an acoustic guitar and plug in, and you can be heard everywhere. You can play everywhere. How does it affect the construction of a guitar to be with a pickup, with a good sounding system or whatever?
I've found that there's probably more difference between acoustic guitars one to another, even though they're the same model made in the same factory on the same day, than one that might have a pickup. Okay? Now, a pickup could affect it, what that percentage of change is, and sometimes it's better. It's so small, it's not measurable, especially when you consider the option that now you have to be able to plug it in. You know, you've got a tuner on board, you might have reverb on board, you may have echo or delay, or, I mean, there's all kinds of different types of preamps out there, and they're just there to give every player more opportunity to experiment with what they might find is their venue or their genre.
It was funny because Clapton came up with this unplugged idea in the 90s,
yeah.
And I think it was 92, and there was this big thing, unplugged, and everybody started playing unplugged, but everybody plugged in from that time. But I think it was good for the guitar manufacturers. It helped a lot because acoustic guitar came back.
Yeah, yeah.
The Beatles brought the electric guitar, Clapton brought the acoustic guitar back.
Sure.
And that helped a lot. And I'm happy to see you still working on guitars, that you didn't retire. It would be a shame if you retired, right?
All right. The difference is that I don't get a regular paycheck. Okay, that's the only thing that's different. And I also don't have time to do as much gardening that I would like or play with my children. But I'm working. You know, I'm always working. And I look forward every day to...
And if you have a chance to look at these guitars, the shadow guitars, you see them on stand C91. There are a couple of guitars, and just have a look. So if somebody has a question to Joe, somebody wants to ask him something, not Joe, Joe is over there, you can ask Joe too, but you can ask Ren also. I looked at him and thought, Joe.
If I don't know the answer, I'll make something up.
Need somebody there who wants to know something from Ren about Gibson, Guild, Shadow, hunting, girls,
surfing.
Where are you living right now? That's a question, okay?
So if we have a small manufacturer, like of 2-3 people, how much time should it take to expand and to grow, like from your experience?
When I had a small Lutheran school, I signed the person up for 90 days, 3 months, and in that 3 months they would learn to build an acoustic guitar or a banjo or a mandolin. They may not complete it, but they would go through all the steps working in my little factory. An interesting question, if I interject, in a factory setting, a guitar can be made. We were visiting with a friend from Spain today, and he has a small factory with independent, or not independent, but individual luthiers working in there. And it takes him about 2 months to create a guitar from the time he begins until it's ready to give to the customer. There have been different times at different factories where the timeline measurement, at Guild it was over 40 hours to build a guitar when I went there. Well, really didn't take that long, except they had to walk 17 miles, and they couldn't make so many, so everybody slowed down. They had a lot of employees, and so the hours still counted against it. When I left Gibson, we had standardized production to the point where we were at 10.4 hours to build an average guitar. Okay? Now that didn't mean that you could start it at 3 o'clock yesterday and it would be done. It still took a long time, but the combined amount of time per instrument was that. That's changed a lot. Bob Taylor got it down to a little over 6 hours years ago. Okay? He went to UV finish. Joe has taken UV finish to Mars. I mean, he's got a technique where he puts a finish on a guitar that is so glossy and so thin that in many cases you don't even need to buff the guitar. It's as perfectly shiny as it's going to be, and it happens in moments. I mean, it is hard when it comes out of the curing oven. It's wet and it's hard. It's right out there. And I think Joe is well under 5 hours for a guitar, So
Er sagt 2,6 Stunden, 2.6.
He's a liar. No. No, I believe it. It's amazing.
But just to make the people understand, the most time space is lacquer, sanding, waiting. Lacquering, sanding, waiting.
The process at Gibson,
and with the UV
10 days to get the finish on, and yet the only amount of time that was used on that finish was about 4 hours total with the sanding and buffing and everything else. But it still had 10 days to elapse to dry.
And with the UV, also das Ultraviolett, das ist diese UV-Lackierung, die geht halt wirklich, wie er es gesagt hat, blitzschnell. It takes seconds and it's done. You can touch it.
You can sand it.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that I think is really important is the finish on the exterior of a guitar is on there not just to make them attractive. It's to keep rain and spit and grease and everything else from soaking into the wood, because all of those will degrade the sound of the instrument. So we put a finish on it, and it's critical that it's very, very thin. I know, but I can't think what the millimeter is that we're putting on at Joe's, but in 0.06, which is probably about 3/1000. That's the thickness of a sheet of paper. Okay, Gibson is up about 8 to 10,000 in their factory. Guild was the same. Taylor's is much thinner because it's UV. Martin on many of their guitars is much thinner. The less finish you have and the better protection, the more the instrument's allowed to breathe. And that's what moves the sound that the wood creates when the energy is pushed through it. So the more flexible that coating is, the better the instrument performs, and you're hearing everything that it has to offer, instead of it being wrapped in a tight wrap of some kind.
Anybody else? Question? Because the problem with Ren is you think you can talk to him for 30 minutes, and then after an hour,
I'm still talking.
he's still talking. And when I did the first interview with him years ago, you were still using tape recorders, and I sure ran out of tape. But we are not running out of tape, we're running out of time. So thank you very much for telling us
for the
stories about the past and the future, and we're looking forward for you working for a long, long, long time.
Oh, I will. I will.
Thank you so much. Give a big hand for Ren.